Thanks for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi. Well, the United States reached its borrowing limit last month. What that means is that Congress has to raise the debt ceiling, which is the amount of money that the U.S. can borrow. But there are some very loud rumblings from congressional Republicans in particular that they want stipulations attached to any raising of that debt ceiling. That potentially sets up a political showdown this spring or most likely early this summer, sometime in June, that could have major consequences. Marcus Schneider, an associate professor of economics at the University of Denver, joins us now to discuss what those consequences could be and basically kind of what this all means and how it could impact us on a day-to-day basis. So, Professor, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, Professor, I guess before I get into anything else, did I get that right? And is there anything else I missed in there that we should know about the debt ceiling specifically?
No, you got it pretty right. It's a kind of interesting decision process that Congress has designed for itself in the early part of the 20th century to make decisions on how much to spend and what to spend on separately from a sort of absolute limit in dollar terms on how much it can borrow. And throughout history, that sometimes has led to problems. Most of the time, it's been a non-issue, and Congress has simply, as a matter of business, raised the debt ceiling as necessary.
Now, what would happen if we decide in early June that we don't want to raise the debt ceiling or we just can't reach an agreement on it? What would happen at that point?
So this is something that economists are, to a surprising degree, very much in agreement about, that would just be a very bad scenario. And the reason is that not just in our financial markets, but in global financial markets, U.S. debt, so bonds that the U.S. government issues through the Treasury, are seen as, in a sense, the ultimate safe asset. And so anybody who's working to diversify risk across their portfolio uses that as a backstop, as a safe asset to reference risk premiums from. A default sort of calls into question of whether U.S. debt is really that safe, and basically causes an upheaval in all of those risk calculations across portfolios across the world. And that would throw global financial markets into quite an upheaval.
So let me think about this, and correct me if I'm wrong here. Based on what you're saying here, Professor, would an analogy be like you decide to stop paying your mortgage? Is that a way to think of it?
In a sense, yes, right. And so you would be requalified as a much riskier borrower, right, when you stop making those payments, and would have a harder time borrowing. Actually, more accurately, borrowing in the future would become more costly, right? But also, this isn't just that it becomes more costly for the government, it's likely to become more costly for all U.S. consumers, because ultimately the government represents us as a country.
So let's go down that. I kind of want to go down the rabbit hole a little bit of if we can't reach an agreement on the debt ceiling. You mentioned how it would become more expensive for us to borrow. We're the ultimate safe currency and borrower in this situation. What sorts of maybe downwind impacts could that lead to? Could it perhaps lead to a recession or something like that?
Oh, it would almost certainly lead to a recession. As I mentioned earlier, I called it upheaval. Really, what I had in mind is a global financial crisis, as I think all kinds of valuations that are currently pegged off of that U.S. debt would have to be recalculated and reevaluated.
Oh boy, well, that's not fun. Well, with that said, you mentioned at the beginning that this has never happened where the U.S. has not raised the debt ceiling. But back in 2011 and 2013, we did come close both times with similar political battles. But my understanding is in those times that we did see some downwind ramifications as a result of simply the proxy fight over it. Long story short, those two battles did lead to some issues back then, didn't it?
It did. And in fact, U.S. debt was downgraded in its quality by one of the ratings agencies, and that resulted in higher borrowing costs. Now, we never quite, as you said, we didn't breach the debt limit. We didn't default on our debts. And so it never came to sort of the full storm of things. But I think we're potentially looking at a different situation here unless something comes through in the last minute.
Professor, I also heard some rumblings about a possible types of workarounds from the Treasury Department. How would that work, and could they be effective if, again, politically there's no resolution to this?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ideas that have been floated, although Secretary Janet Yellen has pretty much put the kibosh on most of them, as far as I know. One of them is this idea that the Treasury can simply print more money instead of going into debt. That can work in the short term, but ends up devaluing the value of the dollar, which sort of has other undesirable consequences, potentially downstream, especially since we're coming out of a period of high inflation already. That seems unlikely. Another option that has been talked about is prioritizing who gets repaid. Apparently that was looked at in previous fights, but again, both the White House and Treasury Yellen have made the point that, one, being unwilling to sort of really do that. The Treasury says that this is not something that they're authorized actually to really do in the first place. The other problem is that it creates all kinds of other issues that make it unclear that it would really work. Right? The U.S. would still default on its debt, and this idea that if we prioritize paying bondholders over, say, making other payments like paying government employees, that would hold off a recession. But that's actually very unclear if you look at how many people are employed by the government who would then not be able to pay their debts, their bills.
Oh, so that'd be kind of like you owe on 4 credit cards and you're trying to decide maybe which 2 to pay off.
That's right. That's right. Or paying off a credit card instead of paying your rent, right? Not it doesn't really get you out of the fact that you're not be able to pay all of your bills, right? And creditors will recognize that.
Okay, so I'm going to wade into a little bit, admittedly, some political territory here, but surely there's a reason I'm going in here. So I kind of want to make the argument from both sides. The Republicans are saying that the amount of debt that the U.S. has right now is unsustainable. That's why they're seeking some of these concessions. I guess to maybe expand into the Republicans' point here, again, I know there's a political lean to this question, but how bad is the nation's budget deficit at this point?
Well, I am not personally and professionally not particularly concerned about the nation's deficit. I think I look at it this way. I think there's a lot of narrative out there about balancing budgets, and it's like households tightening their belts and these kinds of things you hear all the time. But I think that's actually just not accurate. When you look at households, and this is well established in economics, we recognize when households are young, they tend to borrow more in anticipation of growing as a household, of developing their careers and making investments in housing and in transportation and in education into the future. So there's a time in households when most households actually do take on quite a bit of debt. And then later in life, right, they pay off those debts. Now, a country is not like a household in the regard that it doesn't have this well-defined lifespan. We like to think the U.S. will be around for a very, very long time. And certainly the prospects of growth are there for an extended future. So what I really look at that is the U.S. is more like a younger household that is looking to make investments and should make investments in its future to sustain that growth. Now, there's always a question of what are good investments and how is that best done? But that's different than saying we shouldn't spend deficits or we should balance our budgets, which I think is just getting it wrong. The same applies to businesses. Businesses that have a prospect for growth tend to borrow so they can sustain that growth and make that happen, right? So this idea that somehow there's something virtuous about balancing our budgets and not going into deficit spending, I think is just an incorrect argument. It's appealing, but I don't think it reflects the world that we live in and how we should act.
So you would say that you're not all that concerned about the budget deficit and the lack of a balanced budget here in the U.S. right now?
I am not. And especially because what I look at is not so much the debt overall, which tends to be a scary dollar amount that none of us can really imagine. Like most economists, I tend to look at that debt as a percentage of our GDP. So how indebted are we relative to how much economic activity there is in the country? That spiked for understandable reasons during the pandemic because the government did step in and avoided a more full-blown, longer-lasting recession by spending extra. So that's debt we took on. And we do have to sort of figure out what to do with that debt. I'm not saying that that's irrelevant. But what we've seen is that we're coming out of the recession with quite fast growth relative to the last few couple decades. And as a consequence, that ratio of debt to GDP is already declined by about 14%. And so by that measure, we are actually working on, in a sense, working off that debt.
Well, maybe leading from that point to another one. So the argument on the flip side from the Democrats would be that these battles, and again, I know this is a bit more of a political question here, but the way to resolve these sorts of issues is not through it's through Congress, it's through bills and budgeting, and not whether or not to raise the debt ceiling. And again, I know this is a bit more of a political question, but is that your understanding as well as that's how these sorts of budget questions are typically handled?
Yes, absolutely, because we're really litigating here, and there's a good sort of litmus test for me to look at this, right? This comes up when a president from the other party is in power, but the Republicans have taken power in the House, and they're sort of unhappy with recent policy that has happened. Raising the debt ceiling has nothing to do with authorizing future spending. And the Treasury is very clear about that. It's about making good on commitments that through the political process, lawmakers have decided upon already. Now, the Republicans are unhappy because those decisions were made when they were not in power in the House. And so this is really about going back and trying to exert power about something that was already decided. Through the political process, through voters putting more Democrats in the House before the 2022 election.
Okay, and we're coming with another analogy, so hang with me here, Professor. So would this be like I go out and spend, I don't know, I decide to spend some money on things. My wife doesn't like it, so she decides not to pay the credit card bill?
To some extent, right? Or your wife threatening to not do that in order to sort of make you to promise to not go on another shopping spree in the future, right? Because you've already spent the money, it's already on the credit card bill, but now your wife is saying, well, we just won't make rent this month unless you promise not to get a new pair of shoes next month either.
Okay. All right. Okay. I'm just trying to think about this in better ways. But I guess with that said, hopefully we've laid it out for our audience here. Is there anything else that we've missed about the debt ceiling and the potential clash looming ahead that we haven't covered yet?
I don't think so. I think no, there is actually one more thing that I think is very important and very telling in this discussion. And it goes a little bit to the politics of this. One thing that's currently playing out, and that's very telling, is living up to the promises that some Republicans have made to their constituents about balancing a budget, being fiscal conservatives. Actually living up to those promises is very hard, and most voters don't support it. So when you look at analysis of what has to be cut and by how much, most voters, including a lot of Republicans, don't support making those kinds of cuts, which is why what you see now playing out in the House is that a lot of Republicans are very reticent about spelling out what they would cut. And so that's another sort of wrinkle and dimension here, because people don't want Social Security on broad. There are obviously individuals who do, but on broad, the U.S. population does not want Medicare and Social Security touched. If you don't touch those and those cuts, you're looking at really severe cuts in all kinds of other government services that people hold dear.
Yes, and maybe to quickly expand on that here, Professor, my understanding is that in order to have a balanced budget, and again, I've seen the same things that you have, that Republicans mostly, again, wading into political waters here, but Republicans have mostly avoided discussing specifically what they would cut, but economically speaking, we're talking most likely Social Security, basic infrastructure, defense spending, because that accounts for more than half the budget, correct?
Correct. And then, you now start seeing a
Healthcare.
lot of Republicans saying that they would not touch those, in which case you're talking about really extreme cuts to what's left, because to your point, what's left is a pretty small part of the budget.
Mm.
Uh,
Well,
yeah.
interesting, Professor. Well, we appreciate a few minutes of your time here in spelling out, hopefully in a bit more layman terms, in terms of what the debt ceiling crisis is, what sorts of impacts it could have, which don't sound particularly pleasant to say the least. But more than anything, we appreciate you lending us a few minutes of your time and your expertise here, Professor.
You're very welcome. It was great to be on again.
Marcus Schneider, an associate professor of economics at the University of Denver. Thank you again for joining us here on 9 News Plus.